Arrowhead Lake. The ideal and picturesque image of an all-American man-made lake. It's vast, its water's fresh, rarely cold, it's brimming with fish. Like the other big man-made lakes, such as Norman, Harrington, and Thunderbird, Arrowhead had developed somewhat of a colorful cultural superstition. Everything from man-eating leeches with underbellies covered in fangs capable of toppling over canoes, the catfish who grow to an enormous size due to radiation leaks from the nearby plant. And then there's the ghosts. The bargain bin Bigfoot ripoff, and the occasional flying saucer. But none of these things have ever held a place in my mind. Being your typical conservative-raised, athletic type who loved fishing on the lake, I was immune to the fears and warnings from the locals. I'd often scoff when I heard of old Mrs. Cutler telling people how her dog was snatched from the shoreline by Black, the giant man-eating leech with an underbelly covered in teeth. Furthermore, I made it my mission to humiliate and ridicule my peers who had a tale about a cousin who was eaten or drowned by something under the surface. In other words, I was a bit of an ass. In my defense, I have never seen anything to suggest my version of the world was wrong. I had lived on the lake, went fishing with my grandpa throughout my childhood before his boating accident, and I had become convinced that there wasn't anything to be afraid of. There's something in that lake. In truth, it's the reason I'm writing this up, partly to see if anyone else encountered what I saw, partly to warn people to stay away, and also partly as a form of therapy, to help me come to terms with what I experienced. Firstly, we need some context for my encounter, and I think it all began after high school. You see, growing up on that lake, there was a few jobs for those of us who dived out of school with barely an idea of what to do next. It was either work in the power plant or work on the lake, so I combined the two and made it my mission to get some more grades and more training under my belt, and then come back to work as an underwater engineer. It was exciting at the thought of fixing the dam and repairing the plant's coolant tunnels where the lake water was pulled in and used to keep the reactors safe. Mostly, I was just curious to see what actually was down there, below the still surface of Arrowhead. The first person I told was my grandpa, but uncharacteristically, he was far from enthusiastic and made a point of telling me in a tone I had never known he possessed to stay out of the lake. Naturally, I laughed it off, telling him I was shocked he believed Mrs. Cutler's old fish wife tale, the one of a man-eating leech and brown, drowning catfish. He rolled his sleeves and began to show me various scars from the fish he encountered on the lake and elsewhere. The one set he never spoke of. A particular arrangement of deep cuts running up his arm. I asked him how he got them, and his face went pale. He told me that unlike the others, these wounds weren't from catfish, or gars, alligators, or eels, but rather from his boating accident. Never before had he discussed what actually happened that day out on the lake, and he still refused to tell me much. Instead, he diverted the conversation back to the lake's folklorist tales. He told me of the Arrowhead 3, a group of divers in their 80s who went down to fix something in the dam and never came back. It was a story I was familiar with. 5 went down, only 2 of them came back up, and the other 3 vanished without a trace. They were ruled as accidental drownings caused by manufacturing equipment. They didn't find their bodies, though, and so they too became part of the local lake lore of Arrowhead. My response to this was to do a childish, ooh, scary, something my grandfather didn't take kindly to. He snapped at me and exclaimed that he knew the lads who survived. One of them was found swinging. The other drank himself to death. My grandpa asserted that one night, when he sat in the company of the man drowning his liver in beer and whiskey chasers, the man told him what he remembered. He spoke of dark serpents, things emerging out of thin air, and snatching them one by one, dragging them into the unknown. I laughed this off and said aloud, I didn't expect my grandpa, a weathered, beaten old fisherman, an ex-naval officer, to be so superstitious. His face became a scowl, and his gruff voice spoke to me. Them's bad waters. I've seen things I wish I hadn't, things that would strike you dead of fright. You young'uns think you know the world, think you've seen it from behind your screens, but you haven't. Stay out of them waters, and especially keep away from that plant, Grandpa commanded. Sadly, that was one of the last things I remember of him. As well as I went out of state for training. He passed away. Still, I thought the best way to honor him and his memory would be to totally disregard his warnings and worries, and to get to work on the lake as soon as I was qualified. So once the training was completed, I returned home, got a job with the power plant as an engineer, and since I was one of a handful of people qualified for underwater repair jobs, I became somewhat invaluable. I mean, the jobs weren't flying in, and in some ways that was reassuring. I mean, no one wants to be working at a power plant that regularly has power failures or structural damage. However, I couldn't help feeling I had wasted some of my time training for underwater repairs when most of the time I was just sorting out maintenance and basic repairs around the plant. Perhaps some sadistic god out there sensed my disappointment in not being given a chance to dive. Because out of the blue, one of the higher-ups approached me and asked if I'd be willing to help sort out a problem. According to him, one of the 2 cooling tunnels had stopped working properly. The consensus was that there may have been damage to the tunnel, and it had partially collapsed. But the higher-ups wanted to assess the damage first, and then, if it was a simple unclogging or relatively straightforward repair, we'd get to fixing it. So me and another guy suited up for a dive, Eddie, the guy joining me. He was a sweet guy, always eagerly trying to reassure me. Since this was my first proper dive, on a little motorized raft, we made our way to the area just above the underwater tunnels. There we disembarked and we slipped off from the security of a small raft, and we sank into the water. Being that he was a bit older than me, he made a point prior to us entering the water of saying to just stick with him. He told me that it gets quite murky down there, and add in the fact that it was nighttime and it was a recipe for your mind to play tricks. He wasn't wrong either, because I remember feeling an overwhelming dread after only a few minutes into the dive. The kind of dread one feels when you feel like you're being watched, or when you're alone in the house and think that you hear someone. Irrational dread. That's what I told myself, just my body reacting to the fact that I could barely see anything in front of my face. So on I swam, trying my best to ignore the anxiety rising in me and focus on the task at hand. Soon, though, my mind was back to observing my surroundings in an over-vigilant manner. I remember the water getting warmer. The deeper we swam, it got more and more cloudy as we descended. Though it was dark and murky, my torch occasionally caught glimpses of catfish that were large enough to make me feel even more uncomfortable, but I tried to keep my nerve. Plenty of food, warmth, and depth. What fish wouldn't thrive in such conditions, I told myself. Besides, I never saw a catfish that could honestly say was capable of man-eating, or of drowning me. That was somewhat reassuring. Then suddenly, they scattered. All of them, the big ones, the small, thrashing their way past me and Eddie, as they shot out from their hiding places. That should have been the only warning that we needed, but we foolishly thought that we had disturbed them. I mean, how were we to know that we were about to come face to face with the truth? We were at the cooling tunnels when things took a turn. Eddie went about looking at one on the right, shining a torch into it, whilst I inspected the left. My one appeared to be working fine, sucking in water, turning it up into the power plant basin, where presumably it spat it back out on the other side. In the short time it took for me to inspect the tunnel, something happened. Having looked away for just a moment, I was shocked. When I turned to find Eddie, had vanished. Frantically, I spun my head around, but there was no sign of him. Not a trace of Eddie existed in the gloom. If it had been a joke or he was messing with me, I would have at least expected to have seen some debris kicked up from his frantic swimming as he dived out of my line of sight, and yet there was nothing. I paused for a time, waiting for him to suddenly jump out of the opaque surroundings, scare the hell out of me. That would have been a welcome terror. But fate was not kind, and Eddie did not reappear or reveal himself. Truthfully, my heart began pounding a little faster the minute I saw he was gone. And from the isolation, all I could think of was my grandpa's words. Them be bad waters. They repeated and repeated, thundering through my head almost as fast as my heart thundered in my chest. It was in those moments of fear I spotted it. The faint yellow glow shining below and drifting deeper and deeper. Eddie. It was his torch. I could see it in the mist below. He must have been playing a prank on me after all, and maybe he dropped his welding tool. Relief washed over me, and I swam down to meet him, but as I kicked frantically, my eyes began to see more clearly. The light ahead of me was his torch. That much was true, but Eddie wasn't holding it. Instead, it was just sinking down to the depths of the lake, adrift and abandoned, not unlike myself. Concerned for my colleague's safety, I swam back up to the tunnel. I started worrying that maybe he was clearing out the debris in the blocked tunnel and somehow it turned on and he got sucked in. I turned my torch on to the tunnel entrance. It was wide enough to fit a truck through it, and its gaping maw was dark and empty. Strange, because there didn't seem to be any structural damage. No sign of a blockage at all. It was just a void. A black void, so dark that even my torch's light couldn't penetrate it. Primal dread filled me as I looked into the silent and still shadows filling the opening. My courage and confidence were devoured by the darkness. It was all-consuming. I felt more lost than I had ever felt before, and I floated in front of the coolant tunnel, staring into the abyss, hoping to see Eddie emerge from the void unharmed. Only it wasn't a void at all. And it was far from empty. For as my torch shined across the night-colored surface, it shimmered, stirred, squirmed even. Then, to my utter disbelief, an eye blinked open. An eye the size of a car tire. Fear struck me and sent me scrambling back for a second, and between the midst of panicked bubbles streaming up around my goggles, I saw the enormous thing slowly shifting in the tunnel. Great, thick, black-backed tentacles unfolding around the large, phosphorus eye, with each limb displaying red rings of light that pulsed and moved across the dark skin of the beast, growing ever quicker in the motion as the glowing deep blue focused its horizontal slit-shaped pupil on me. And as it saw me, I too saw it. Saw the thing for what it was, and though my mind could not process the reality, I was sure of it. The thing in the tunnel, the blockage, was an enormous cephalopod, a giant octopus, a kraken of monstrous dimensions, a creature clever enough to conceal itself as the shadow inside a tunnel and evade the sight of a bustling lakeside community. It was evident from this and from its appearance that the creature was far from ordinary. Beneath each black tendril running under it were fangs and toothy hooks, which retracted and extended in and out of red flesh. These appendages clasped the exterior and the rim of the tunnel, slithering outward in serpentine manners. I froze in place, and my mind raced back to the wounds upon my grandfather's arms, the strange toothed pattern running up his sleeve. Those could have been caused by such an appendage. Then worse still, I came to understand those fishwife tales of Blackback the Leech with its underbelly of fangs. The stories that I had dismissed in my arrogance were true. Only it wasn't a man-eating leech, it was a tentacle. One of many tentacles that were about to reach out and snatch me as they had done the Arrowhead 3. I knew what was about to happen, and I swam for my life, rushing to the surface as hard as I could. I looked back down to see if the thing was getting closer or giving chase or following, but it wasn't. There was nothing beneath me or around me. Just total absence. My mind immediately realized it was still there. It was hidden. It was camouflaged. And around the time it took for me to realize that, it was too late. A toothy tentacle emerged from the gloom, shifting from the grimy green, murky color of the water around me as it grasped hold of my back. I fumbled and wrestled, desperately trying to wriggle free, but it was no use. As more and more tentacles reached around me and their hooks pierced my suit and skin, I screamed and cried out, but beneath the water, my voice was silenced. Then it pulled me in close towards what could only be described as a pair of tusks and gnashing jaws stuffed with broken fangs. It was like the mouth of hell, an inescapable grinder acting on total impulse and instinct, just desperate to crush, skewer, and maul me into shreds. Before it could devour me, like I presumed it had devoured Eddie, I remembered. I was far from unarmed, and in a frantic motion, I scrambled for my welding tool and turned it on. White and blue punctured and burned into one of the tentacles holding me. Instantly, it untangled away from me. Like a torpedo, it shot back, recoiling in opaque walls around me, disappearing once more as its chromatophores shifted and made it visible to my eyes. I knew it was still there, and so without a moment of hesitation, I began swimming for the surface, sure that nightmarish, amorphous thing was right behind my every kick. Desperate to survive, I unclipped my harness and let the oxygen tank sink below me, trying to remove as much weight from me as I possibly could, and the moment I let it go, I saw it. A vast black, writhing nest of tooth-covered appendages, grasping hold of the tank and dragging it into the depths below. With one final surge of adrenaline, I thrashed my way to the surface and onto the boat. And let me tell you, it didn't make me feel any safer being on that tiny raft, knowing that beneath me there was a monster-sized octopus more than capable of dragging me and the boat down to its sunken nether realm. And even after speeding the boat onto the shoreline, I couldn't expel the imagined images of that thing clambering ashore to get me. I told the higher-ups what I saw, and I explained what I believed had happened to Eddie, but as you can imagine, no one believed me. Eddie became another tragic event on the lake. An oxygen tank malfunction which killed him. A conclusion that the authorities reached without an autopsy or even a body. The wounds I had suffered, nothing more than self-inflicted according to the power plant's first aider. The side effect of nitrogen narcosis. Quit. I quit and I stopped going out fishing in my spare time. But I continued to warn people. Tell them what I saw on the lake. Just as the tales of Blackback the man-eating leech, now others were skeptical of my tale. The tale of an old one-eyed octopus living in the coolant tunnels of the power plant. I've had experts, Facebook critics alike tell me how there are no freshwater octopuses. It's impossible for them to get to the size that I described. And to them I have to say this. As my grandpa told me, Lake Arrowhead is bad water, and should they dive beneath its surface with that same skepticism that I had, you'd be met with the truth. There's something in that lake. I don't know how. I don't know why. Or what it is exactly. But it's there. And it's hungry. Hey there, kids. It's me, MrCreepyPasta. I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to tonight's story or watching tonight's video. I appreciate it. As always, I cannot thank you enough for always being here. And if you guys would like to see more or hear more, then I'd appreciate it if you click that subscribe button. Or if you're listening on the podcast, then click the follow button. You guys like words, right? I speak words. You guys hear words. Also, did you know you can read words? They put a lot of words into things called books. And I have 2 of those on Amazon. MrCreepyPasta's CreepyPasta collection. Volumes 1 and Volume 2 are available now on Amazon, if you give them a search, or you could just scroll down to the description. And as always, I want to give a big thank you to all you guys who support on Patreon, patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, especially Jacob Schaefer, Jay, Zach, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Ken Lando Higuchi, Bobby Karman, Tristan Pelton, Chase Burnett, Diana Kraus, Katrina Beisel, Kayden the Spooky Boy, Zane Nightshade, MyBodySoundsLikeRiceKrispys, AshWood, Lord of the Weebs, Miss Xandra, MrUnsettlingSpaghetti, Eurogore, Tsuji Campbell, Marco Takes Dabs 420, Stricken, Azurine Fox, Robert White, Andreas Garza, Snails Brennan, Legit Quad Feed, Fried Chicken 12, James Bruce, Chris Levin, Freddie Krueger, Ty Nanny, Justin Johnson, 1-800-Nightmare, Unknown Nobody, Michael Scarborough, Jason Wilson, Infernal One, James Lowe, Lisa Cottrell, Jimbo the Hutt, Caspian, Jordan Nels, Hades' Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Brian Arce, Cryptic Nightmares, Brennan Wright, Someone You Love, S-Man, Kiwi the Sloth, Liam Newman, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Nina Smith, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Talon Karlik, Daniel Polson, Trace Miles, and Corey Kenshin. Thank you guys so much for supporting me, and if you guys would like to join them on the list of people's names I mispronounce, you can always do so at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, as well as all those fine people in the description down below who help support this channel and keep the lights on and give treats to Hylas and Hercules. You guys, as always, are the real MVPs, and I love and appreciate every single one of you who support there or just support anywhere by watching and subbing. So good night, everybody, and sweet dreams.